Good morning. This is the Blaine's World podcast that can be found each week on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. You can also listen in on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and you get more information at our website, which is www.blainesworld.net. I'm your host, Blaine Greenfield, and here in my Zoom studio in lovely downtown Fairview, North Carolina. Each week, we focus on positive news and information about people and organizations in both Western North Carolina and throughout the country. And toward that end, it's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Schwartz, private investigator and author of Confessions of an Investigative Reporter, which you can also see behind Matthew. And Matthew, you can feel free to wave to all your fans and friends who are watching this. Okay.
Hi, everybody.
And nice it's nice to have you. That is Matthew Schwartz. And Matthew has quite a background, as you'll learn. He had a career as an investigative reporter, and he's told approximately 10,000 stories on television stations across country. But who counts, Matthew, right? We don't, 10,000. And this will be maybe 10,001. He has won more than 200 awards, including 4 New York Emmys and 4 regional Edward Murrow Awards. Some of his memorable reports include an interview with son of Sam serial killer David Berkowitz, trial mobster John Gotti, 9/11 attacks from Ground Zero, a whole bunch of other things. And of course, we may talk about it. He did a half dozen interviews with an obscure real estate developer who had the name of the guy Donald Trump, I think it was. And
that was
okay. And you got to meet Donald Trump. What a treat! Now living in Weeville, he's the author of this book. And Matthew, let me ask you the first question I always ask first time I meet folks. You grew up where?
Northern New Jersey, Bergen County.
And when you were a kid growing up in Northern County, did you always know you wanted to be an investigative journalist?
About 15 years old, I started thinking that's something I'd want to do. And I think the influence came from my mother, as I write in the introduction to the book. She always championed the little guy. And she took us to civil rights rallies when I'd rather be playing sports or somewhere else. And I think my empathy for the underdog came from her. And I knew I was one of those lucky people that knew what I wanted to do when I was about 15 years old.
It's funny because I had almost a similar background in that I wanted to be a journalism major. I started out as a journalism major, but I eventually gave it up because of the pressure, in terms of having to knock out stories in a short period of time. So I stopped in college, but you went on from 15 years old. Were you writing as a 15-year-old? Doing any writing?
It's stressful. I was writing for the little, high school newspaper.
Me too. Yeah.
And what happened to me was a fortuitous event, having a neighbor by the name of Jim Donnelly, who was a big name in New York local news radio, all news radio, WCBS 880.
Sure. We used to listen all the time.
One of the 2 big ones in New York with 1010 wins. They're both going strong today. Jim lived about less than a mile from me, and he was a client of my father's in business. And when I told my father I want to look into being a journalist, he told me about Jim Donnelly, because I didn't listen at that age. Really, I listened to WABC Top 40 music and Mets games, my favorite baseball team. So I started. I contacted Jim Donnelly. We actually both coached Little League. That's how I met him. And he said, "Yeah, you want to come into work and shadow me? Be at my house at 2:30 in the morning." So I did that many times in high school and college, and observed him. He was on in the morning from 5 till 9 a.m., morning drive time, the most prestigious time in radio.
Is he still around?
No, unfortunately, he passed away some years ago, but he had a long career in New York City, co-anchoring the morning news there with the news director, Lou Adler.
Oh, I know that name too, all the time. Now, when he was with the station then, was he an investigative reporter or just a street reporter?
No, he was just an anchor.
Right.
He was not in the field or investigative. He was just an anchor at the big booming voice, which I wish I had. And I just observed him. And at that time, no, you don't start as an investigative reporter. You start as a general time reporter doing everything. But I was a gopher. I started as a gopher. When I graduated college, Ohio University, with a journalism degree, everybody in the newsroom kind of knew me from just my visits. And they called me 2 weeks after graduating saying, "We have an opening, come in for an interview." And I remember going into the interview when there was a stack of resumes on the secretary's desk about 3 feet high. I remember seeing mine on top, thinking, don't screw this up. Very, very excited. And they hired me from that interview when I was 2 weeks after graduating college. And now this is 6 years after going in there on my vacations from college and, high school, to observe Jim and the whole staff.
Now, when you were in college,
Mhm.
were you interested at that time becoming a print or broadcast journalist?
Great question. Print, actually.
I would think, yeah.
Yeah, this was, I graduated college in 1976, and I thought print. I loved writing. And I thought it was maybe less competitive to get a job. There were just more newspapers than TV stations. And I majored actually in the print sequence in college. And it just evolved later on from print to broadcast.
And in some respects, and we'll talk about it time permitting, boy, has that changed, in terms of when you were a kid, when I was a kid, I remember, and you probably did too, I'd read my grandfather would bring 5 newspapers home, remember when they had a whole bunch of papers, and newspapers were actually 40, 50, 60 pages, and you don't see that too much anymore.
At their zenith, I believe, Blaine, in New York City, because my father brought numerous papers home every day. He commuted from New Jersey, a little town I grew up in, River Edge, in Bergen County. There were, I believe, at its zenith, 11 newspapers in New York City. And now there are 4, if you want to count Newsday, the Long Island paper, right, the Times, the Post, the Daily News, and Newsday. And they both made, drastic cuts, and they're very thin. And now we see suburban papers and in smaller cities publishing only part-time, a few days a week.
And I was so sad. I was such a newspaper junkie when I was a kid, and I loved it, but times have changed. So you got your first job out of college, pretty impressive, and that was it was as a broadcast journalist then, right?
I was a desk assistant at WCBS Radio, and then I was promoted to chief desk assistant. I like to say I was a gopher, then promoted to chief gopher. And then at some point, Blaine, I was there 11 months. At some point near the end of that tenure, I said, I want to get on the air. And some of the experienced guys there said, local TV news is really just, it's exploding. This is again, this is 1977. You should really try local TV news. And I had a lousy tape from college. I was embarrassed to really show to a news director. So I called numerous stations. They said, well, try upstate New York. It's not that far away, and there's some small markets. So I called a bunch of stations in Utica, Syracuse, New York, Buffalo, and Rochester, and I did a white lie and said, hey, I'm on vacation. That part was true, and I'm going to be in your area. Well, I was going there to hope to get an interview, and a couple of them let me do interviews, and the smaller ones in Utica actually let me do an audition right in the studio. And having WCBS on your resume, even though I was a gopher, it didn't hurt. And one of the readings I did, one of the on set, I did a writing test. I wrote, like a 5-minute newscast, and I went on the set and I just read into the camera by myself. Was in Utica, New York, at the ABC affiliate there, WUTR. And about 2 days later, I got a call from the news director, and they hired me. I was about 3.5 hours away, 3.5 hours away from my the house where I lived with my parents. And that was my first job. I was a general assignment reporter at this little station at the 154th market at the time.
Well, you point out something that was probably a useful skill you picked up in college or somewhere else, but I guess it was helpful. You picked up somewhere the skill to learn how to type, or you could type.
I actually took a typing class in high school.
Me too. My mother wanted me to.
I think my parents made me take it. They say it could be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was helpful, yes.
Little did they know, and kids don't type anymore, or they don't write either. They don't teach handwriting either. But times change. So you get your first job upstate New York. How long were you there?
I was there 22 months.
Okay.
And general assignment reporter. I filled in anchoring a few times, and then I wanted to move up. I thought 2 years. My goal, my whole dream, was to be on TV in New York City by my 30th. So the next step up was Richmond, Virginia. I got hired. A colleague of mine in Utica had gotten there before me, and he told the news director about me and walked my tape into the news director's office. And then he flew me down for an interview, and I got hired there. So that was a move of about 100 markets. Richmond, Virginia, from Utica,
Sure.
about 100, about the 150 something market to the 50 something market. And I was there 2 years. And I needed one more stepping stone job before New York City, I felt. And I was a crime reporter in Richmond, crime and courts mainly. And again, some fill-in anchoring. And what happened was, an interesting story in Richmond was, I was working at the ABC affiliate. And we were in last place of the 3 news channels. And I heard about an opening at the NBC. And at a press conference, a reporter from the NBC affiliate told me, hey, my boss really likes your work. We have an opening. Now, in those days, reporters didn't have non-competes in their contracts. We didn't even have anything like that. And anyway, I got hired across the street at the NBC station in the same market. And the boss says to me in my first day, listen, I know you want to go to New York eventually, but I'd like you to stay here at least a year. I said, okay. 3 months later, I got a call out of the blue from the news director of a station in Cleveland, Ohio. I said, may I ask how you heard about me? How'd you see my tape? And he said, the consultant that represents the station you left wants you out of the market, wants you off the competition. And we are all, it was Frank Magid Consulting, which consulted the first station I was at in Richmond. And they wanted me out when I went to the NBC. So I had to do they hired me in Cleveland after 3 months at the second station in Richmond. That was a tough walk into the meeting to tell that guy that wanted me to stay a year. But again, there's no contract. I didn't break the contract. They said, I can't turn this down. Besides the double the salary, it was moving from the 50-foot market. Cleveland was at the time, this is 1981, the 9th market. Now I was at the stepping stone I would need to get better, hopefully, and to be ready to be hired in number 1 market, in my dream market, New York.
So how long were you in Cleveland?
I was in Cleveland also 2 years. So I did 2 years in all of the 3 minor league stops, Utica, Richmond, Cleveland. Cleveland, not so much. I was there 2 years, and I got a call from my mother in 1983 saying, I have some bad news. Your father's been given 6 months to live, the type of cancer. I called my agent as soon as I hung up with my mother, and I said, put the pedal to the metal now. I told him about my father. And shortly thereafter, my agent called me saying this Channel 9 is expanding WOR, expanding their news team. They're adding a bunch of newscasts, and the guy likes it. The boss likes your tape. So they flew me in and hired me. And I started there October 24th, 1983, which was exactly my 30th birthday.
Oh, wow. So when you were in New York, back to New York, you were still doing general reporting?
Yes. Anything and everything. Crime du jour. I was not doing investigative. I could do anything, even some light features until we had a feature reporter, anything and everything. But it was mostly, I was one of 2 of the main live reporters at night. And it was the best way to say this, crime du jour, whatever, breaking news. And they had a newscast then at prime time. It was the first one in New York. They called News 9 prime time, eventually changing to the 10 o'clock news later on.
I'm surprised you didn't want to become a sports reporter.
People ask me that because I'm a sports nut. Okay?
Exactly.
I watch a lot of sports. I love sports, but I always felt there were fewer jobs at every station. You might have 2 sports jobs.
Good point.
And 15 news jobs, let's say, depending on the market. I just felt it was more practical career-wise to go into news. And sports was always a hobby and news was a job. I've written sports for some newspapers on a freelance basis. I love sports, but I just felt to get in. And I filled in anchoring sports. In fact, in New York, we had the brothers of the legendary Marv Albert, Steve and Al Albert.
Sure, I know, yeah.
Who became friends of mine. And when I moved to Tucson, Arizona later in my career, Steve was the TV voice, the play-by-play voice of the Phoenix Suns, and we reconnected. And I went to a couple games and met up with Steve. So when they were before they were hired, when they had a need for a sportscaster, when they let some people go on and off, I was always the pinch hitter, so to speak, on weekends, filling in until I hired a new guy. So that's why I went into news. Really, just I thought it'd be more practical, more jobs, and also just I just think the realm of stories would be more interesting to me. And I always had an interest in true crime, and the mafia and its history, and those things, serial killers, and I still do now with all the streaming shows that are on.
Well, it's listening to you, I hope other people are too. You're giving some very good pragmatic advice to folks. And that is, I mean, I'm really impressed with your timetable. You had mapped it out in your mind where you wanted to go, till age 30. And then you gave another thing you mentioned is to look for where there are going to be jobs. So you're absolutely right. They might have 15 reporters versus 2 sports reporters or something. So your odds are greater of getting a gig, I guess.
And I always tell young journalists, well, 2 of the things I tell them is don't worry about majoring in journalism.
Right.
It's overrated, because if you don't know history and political science and government, you're not going to be able to report very well if you don't have a knowledge of history and those other things. But work at the station, either in town or at your college. Get practical experience. I like to say, even though I had a great journalism education at Ohio U, I probably learned more in my 11 months as a desk assistant / gopher at WCBS Radio than I did in 4 years of college. But get hands-on experience while you're in school. I never had one potential boss say to me, "Did you major in journalism?"
Interesting. Yeah, you're talking, bring back memories. My first job I got paid for was a little local weekly. I did a sports column. I still remember, Matthew, I got $15 a column, but I was still in high school, so it's pretty cool.
That's great.
Writing. And like you said, right in high school, right in college, right wherever you can, get that experience.
As much as you can. I was a freelancer, even while I was a gopher at WCBS on weekends for the Bergen Record. Some people call it the Record of Hackensack. That's its formal name, but real old Bergenites in northeastern New Jersey call it the Bergen Record. And the Record, which still publishes, I think maybe 5 or 6 days a week, the print edition. I wrote, they'd send me to a high school football game on weekends, and they'd pay me whatever it was at the time, I think $30. And I'd call the coaches during the week, and I loved doing it just to get writing experience. And I'd go to a game and write it up, go back to the newspaper and write it up, and that was fun.
How'd you get from real jobs, if you would, to kind of a spin off of that to become an investigative reporter? What got you into that?
So after about 15 years on the air, I kind of got tired of doing the quick, down and dirty crime du jour stories. And it was getting really stressful. When you work all day on a story, a lot of times they'd break you up on that story. They'd call you on the 2-way radio in the news vehicle. This is before cell phones, saying, "Oh, a cop was just shot up in the Bronx. Stop what you're doing, an hour and a half away. We'll cut your story down to a anchor voiceover. Go up to the Bronx in front of the police station or the scene of the shooting, and we'll have you live." I was getting burned out. Okay.
Sure.
And so investigative reporting, I felt, was more substantive. I was a big fan of 60 Minutes and to go back to Edward R. Murrow, one of my heroes. And I said, that's what I want to do. And around the time I was starting to think, actually, to get into public relations, go to the dark side, as journalists say, the other side of the business, and maybe even quit. My boss called me, and it was one of the great days of my career, April 1st, 1992, and he put me on the expanding I-team, the investigative team at Channel 9 in New York. They added a couple reporters to it, and I was one of them.
You remember your first big story?
My first big story?
From an investigative standpoint.
Oh, boy. Well.
Or one of them.
Well, I probably have 4 favorites. I mean, I couldn't tell you them chronologically.
Sure.
I mean, the ones that affect change are my favorites. And it's funny, before we went on, you mentioned one of my probably 4 stories out of the 10,000 I've done. And 10,000 is a ballpark figure of all the stories I've done. And then probably is more than that. But investigative, I was only investigative, the last 20 some years of my 40 years in television. But the Pets on Planes story that you referenced was about airline having no thought, care, very sloppy handling of cats and dogs on airplanes and the cargo holds. and they were dying or being injured at an alarming rate. We're getting a lot of complaints about them. So we went undercover. A producer of mine traveled with some pet owners with their pets in cargo holds, and we recorded with hidden cameras the shabby treatment. I mean, to give you one example, my producer was on an airplane on a tarmac in Houston, Texas, where, on the ground it was maybe 130 degrees, and the handler just, like threw the crate in the middle of the tarmac in the sun, where if he walked about 10 more feet, there'd be shade and make a huge difference. But that happened all the time. And, travelers, air passengers could easily find out an airline's record as far as being on time is concerned, but they couldn't find out anything about its record with pets. So I did that story in the mid 90s to late 90s at Channel 9 in New York. And a senator named Frank Lautenberg saw the story, and his office called me and said he wants to meet with me about it. And I interviewed him. I believe it was the next night after the first piece. It was a two-part series. So after the two parts aired, and he then sponsored a bill, which eventually was signed into law by President Clinton, calling for tougher laws on the handling and accountability of airlines for pets on planes. And then the old talk show, some of your viewers may remember, and listeners, the Montel Williams show.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It came to their attention, and they asked me to be on the show. And I always felt, I didn't like making those kind of appearances, that let my work do the talking. The show was on Channel 9, and my management wanted me to be on, but I thought, the rest of the country should know about this so they can also hold the airlines accountable, the consumers, the travelers. That's one of my favorite stories. The interview with the son of Sam is probably one of my better known stories. David Berkowitz, the serial killer.
Hold on that one. I just want to finish up on the first story. Fascinating. Yeah. So now, I mean, pretty exciting stuff. You got a law passed. You met a whole bunch of people on this. Did you at the time, or do you have now pets?
Excuse me?
At the time, did you have pets, or do you have pets now?
Well, now I do, yes.
Yeah, I mean, so it's an eye-opening thing.
But growing up, we always had a dog and sometimes a cat around. I mean, my parents were pet lovers, and no, I just always have loved, pets, and was always, I think, empathetic to their plight and their owners' plights when they're wanting to travel with them.
Because I ask you that for a reason, and I'll just ask you one specific thing you can tell folks. If you have a pet, you want to take the pet to travel. You mentioned something about it's hard to get stats for that kind of information. What should people look for when they take their pet on a plane?
Well, now you can actually check it out with the airlines, first of all. And you should just ask questions of the airline. And now they have to answer because of this law. But now I don't know how much of that is accessible online. That's something they'd have to look into. But of course, I see now a lot of people traveling where you could actually buy a seat for your dog.
Right.
Your dog is too large, like one of ours is, to fit in a kennel.
Oh, very exciting stuff. Fast forward then to the son of Sam story. I interrupted you. Talk about that one.
No, that's okay. So David Berkowitz, who shot 13 people in 1977 and 78 and killed 6 of them in New York City, had not, on Lover's Lanes mainly, but he had not given an interview in many years. He was sentenced to 6 life terms, and his parole was coming due. It's just an obligatory thing. He's not ever going to get out of prison with what he did. But by law in New York City, you get a parole hearing after 25 years. And I had become aware of this through an article in a newspaper in New York. So my producer went up to the prison he was at in Sullivan County, New York in 2002. And he said, well, I want to check this guy, Matthew Schwartz, out and see what he wants to ask me. And then he and I, Berkowitz and I, started a series of, I say we became pen pals. Some letters. I wouldn't give him a list of questions in advance. I said, we don't do that, but you could tell your side of the story. And eventually he agreed to an interview, and it took place in the Shawangunk State Prison in upstate in Sullivan County, New York in May of 2002. And it was quite fascinating meeting a serial killer.
How many interviews did with him? Just the one?
It was one, and it was an hour and a half long, close to 2 hours long, and it was a very long piece, about 8.5 minutes. And There's a whole chapter about this in my book. And also, that led the newscast that night. And then we had so much good leftover sound bites from him that at 10:30 that night, at the bottom of the hour newscast, we did about 4 minutes of just in his own words of him talking. So yeah, we probably could have got more out of it, even more pieces out of it. There's been a resurgence in interest in Berkowitz thanks to a Netflix show,
Right.
which has been discredited by the investigators that I interviewed, about that he was in some kind of a devil worship cult. And the investigators, because later in life, he gave some interviews. I mean, later in this journalist's life, named Maury Terry, he did some interviews with Berkowitz, and Berkowitz kind of changed his story, where at first he said he acted alone, that he heard voices from his neighbor Sam's dog, hence the nickname Son of Sam. And that's been discredited by all the investigators. Berkowitz never brought this up until he was incarcerated for many years. So he acted alone. He had a lot of issues, and nothing had to do with any kind of devil cult. No one else has been arrested. And that's been totally discredited by the investigators that worked the case and knew it better than anyone. And they told me that on camera and off.
There was also a movie, aside from the Netflix series, excellent movie. I forget the name of it, about Berkowitz. But I remember watching that. So that's two stories. You mentioned there were four. What were the other two?
Well, there were two stories I did that ended up with the crook going to prison. One of them, a woman who was renting out apartments to the same people, different people, the same apartment. And the other thing she did was she moved in with this guy that she met on a dating site, and she stole about $20,000 from him. And she was just a con artist, and we were tipped off to her by the guy that she moved in with. And she went to prison for 3.5 years. And there was also another person that ended up incarcerated after we did some stories. A detective in Pima County, Arizona, Tucson, who, after a large theft, about $1 million of burglary from a home in the foothills prominent section of Tucson, about this large theft, the items were found at pawn shops. And instead of telling the victim, hey, your stolen stuff, I found it at pawn shops, he got the stuff from the pawn shops and he pawned it and sold it himself. So that detective, for that story, what happened, the only time in my career, I actually got the audio recordings from a source of mine, the recordings of the internal affairs cops questioning this detective, the audio of the interviews, which has never happened before in my career. And when I tell this to other investigative reporters, I mean, that's what we call in the business a great get, to get something like audio. Another story I loved was odometer pullbacks at a major car dealership. There was a dealership, we got tipped off that, and this was an inside tip, the best kind of somebody that worked there.
Right, sure.
This car dealership in New Jersey was selling cars as new. The odometer would say, 5 to 10 miles on it. But the executives, the GM and his top salespeople, were driving these cars for up to a year, to and from their homes, all kinds of personal reasons. And a fixer would come in and set back the odometers. And they would detail the cars to make them look new. So, you, Blaine, would be buying a car that you would think was brand new, but it was actually a year old with maybe 10 or 12,000 miles on it. And that dealership ended up getting shut down after I did a series of reports on them.
Let me ask you a question in terms of that series of reports or other stuff you do. Were you ever scared for doing some of this stuff, or did you ever get people make threats at you or to you? Because
I was threatened. I was threatened often, but when the camera's on in their face, nobody except for the father of a fortune teller, who we exposed after she had taken thousands of dollars from some women in Newark, New Jersey. He came at me with a baseball bat. But honestly, I backed up and he didn't really run after us. And I felt, oh, that's great TV. And as long as he doesn't hit me, he was swinging a bat. He was swinging a bat at me. So, we also shut them down. So the stories that, you feel the best about are the ones the compelling ones people will talk about, but also when you affect some change. When you put people in prison, I'm not saying I'm happy about putting anybody in prison, but I'm happy if they've ripped off people and they deserve to pay for the consequences. If they're corrupt, like a corrupt cop or that corrupt landlord lady who stole from the boyfriend, those things, you feel you got some justice and maybe you made a bit of a difference and your stories are more impactful.
Yeah, I just have to respectfully disagree with you though on one point. You're saying that, the guy didn't hit you, with the bat, probably would have made a better story had he hit you. Yeah, it'd be, get more notoriety out of it. But let's talk about the whole concept of journalism or investigative journalism. What do you think of it now? It's changing, would you say?
Well, there's less of it, and that's sad. Everything now with 24-hour news cycles and the rush to be first and the emphasis on digital. And I get all the reasons for that, but I believe there's some quality investigative journalism going on, but the quantity of it, the amount of it is much lower than it was 20, 15 years ago. The news budgets have shrunk. The number of stations doing news and all news channels and websites especially have exploded, especially digitally. And I think there's just such a rush to it. They don't give investigative reporters, generally speaking now. I'm not saying there's no good investigative journalism going on now, it's like by the New York Times, Washington Post, and some websites, but they don't give investigative journalists the time they need to properly conduct an investigation.
Well, the other thing, and since we mentioned him, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you talk about like Donald Trump. Another problem I have with investigative journalism is it seems to focus on one or two stories, the Trump stuff is just never ending. And that's all they seem, Washington Post, Times, that's all they seem to cover. Every day they have X number of reporters digging up that stuff. It must be tough to be a reporter to try to find something new or unusual or unique.
It absolutely is. The thing about Donald Trump that always amazed me when I first came in contact with him is he was a real estate developer in New York City and really not known that well outside of New York City, really until the show The Apprentice, for which I kind of blame one of my old networks for making him famous, NBC. And I always wondered, and I wrote this in the book, assignment editors would send us to interview Trump about something about politics, or say the Central Park case where the woman was raped in became known as the Central Park jogger. And he was wrong about that, but Trump was, when he wanted to execute the 6 teenagers who were proven later did not do it. But I always wondered why did we always send reporters to interview Trump on something that was not relevant to his real estate empire, that had nothing to do with it. And it was kind of lazy by the assignment editors. It was, because he's Donald Trump, he's well known in the tri-state area, and he's funny, and he gives a good soundbite. And I interviewed him about half a dozen times in Trump Tower.
And did he give a good soundbite?
Well, he gave good sound bites. He was funny.
Yeah.
He liked to be seen. Most of the interviews were in the crowded lobby. And I said in the book, he wouldn't be looking at me in the interview. He'd be looking around to see the crowd who's looking at him and who's there seeing it. Only 1 or 2 interviews were actually in his office. But yeah, and I was at his famous news conference after that woman was raped, the Central jogger. He had put full page, large ads. I can't remember full page, half page, in the 4 major New York newspapers, because he felt Ed Koch wasn't tough enough on crime, and he wanted them to be executed. And then years later, when it was proven by DNA that they didn't do it, and they were released from prison in New York City, had to pay a whole lot of money to all of them. And Cy Vance, the then district attorney, said it was a travesty of justice. When they went to Trump, he said, well, there's some people that don't believe that. I'm not so sure, even though everybody else in the world said they didn't do it.
That's a perfect Trump imitation. It sounds just like what he says. That's a shame, Matthew. Right to this day, he never apologized to them, or
I wrote just that. He's never said he's sorry for anything in his whole life, anything that he was wrong or sorry for on anything.
Yeah. Talk about the book, Matthew. So, what got you to writing? By the way, great title, "Confessions of an Investigative Reporter." You can see it in the back behind Matthew. What got you to writing a book?
So after I was doing investigative reporting in New York City, I was there 20 years, and around the 90s, after I was doing that, late 90s for about 6 years, people would ask me, well, was there more to that story, or whatever happened to that guy? Or the subtitle was going to be stories I couldn't tell on TV, but my publisher thought that was too long. It's going to be Confessions of an Investigative Reporter, stories I couldn't tell on TV. So I started taking notes. I said, I'd like to write a book someday. It's on my bucket list. I could never do it while I'm working. So that's what it was. I started taking notes for a book in the 90s. I said, I'm working 12 hours a day. I can't write. And then towards the end of my career, when I was in Tucson, Arizona, working at the NBC station, I met an author who said to me the words I'll never forget, that told me I could write a book while I'm still working full time. And she said, write a page a day. And I said, I can do that. So I started writing a page a day, and sometimes on weekends more than that, starting in 2019 while I was still working at the NBC station in Tucson. And I thought I'd self-publish. I didn't know how good it was, and I sent the manuscript to several journalists, some I are famous nationally, some I do know, some people out of the business. And they said, this is pretty good. You should try to get it traditionally published. I had all these notes to work with, and I had my old scripts, many of them. And I got an email from a publishing house that loved it and actually gave me a traditional deal that bought it. And it's shot with a small advance even. But, there's great self-published books and great self-published authors. The problem is a lot of bookstores and reviewers, magazines, newspapers, they don't give it the respect that a traditionally published book gets. And once you get on Ingram to be distributed to the Barnes and Nobles of the world, here in Asheville, Malaprops is carrying it. You get more respect. You're carried by the major distributor. And the book got some reviews in some papers that I was thrilled about. But it was a bucket list item, not to have a bestseller, not to make money. And it actually hit #1 when it first came out in its category on Amazon. I thought it was a joke when a buddy sent me a screenshot, a former cameraman I worked with, and I thought it was a joke, trick photography. And then I looked it up, and I was floored. So the success of the book is kind of the icing on the cake. I just want to kind of prove to myself, and I thought it would be interesting, my career.
Well, by the way, again, the name of the book, you can say it's behind Matthew as well, but you can get it on, I just looked it up on Amazon and sold a bunch of very good reviews on Amazon. You can get it traditional bookstores as well. Malaprops has it too. But fascinating book. Let me ask you, this is the first book you wrote. Is there a second one coming down the pike?
Boy, I think I used all my book up in this book. I probably have enough for a second book. Boy, I'll tell you, I can't believe I got the book done while I was working, because it takes a lot out of you. It really does. I mean, I don't know if there's a second one. I think I'd like to do maybe a biography of someone. I just have to find the right person.
Well, but I'm thinking out loud too. It'd make a fascinating novel as well, though. I could see you writing, a novel on some of the stories or based on the stories.
I've had a few people, not the right people, I think, but I've had a few people say, that'd be a great TV movie.
Right.
Some of your experiences in the business and some of the craziness that goes on in newsrooms and the characters you work with. A lot of people tell me that's their favorite chapter, about the characters I worked with. I also write about my own trials and tribulations and my mistakes and failings in my career, including a divorce. That was probably my fault for paying too much attention to my career over, my spouse at the time. But they liked that I wrote, with some honesty, with total honesty. I could have gone longer in this book. In fact, the publisher asked me to cut like 20 pages. They wanted about 250 pages. What people have told me they like is that every chapter is self-contained, so you can jump around.
Well, I love it as I'm reading it, but similar to what you said just before, great advice, write a page a day. Where in here, the beautiful thing about the book, I love it, Matthew, is I do love it. The chapters are short, so you can read just a chapter a night or a chapter a day, and it'll be a fun way to get through the book. So I love the way you follow that advice in terms of writing the book. If people are listening or watching, you're going to be talking about the book, I guess, this week. Is that correct?
the East Village Grill, a restaurant in Asheville, East Village Grill, this Thursday, May 4th at 4 p.m. I'll be there just in the restaurant talking to this book club. And if any of your listeners or viewers would like to show up, I'll be there and answer any questions you may have about how to get the book or my career or anything at all related to the book or my career. I'd be happy to answer them.
And by the way, great little restaurant too. I don't know if you've ever been there, but
I'm looking forward to it. I've heard.
Really great little local place. You'll enjoy it. And I guess a final question, Matthew, we've given a lot of advice during the talk, but if somebody's interested in still, believe it or not, going into journalism or becoming a reporter, any other advice you want to share with them?
I would just say, try to get hands-on experience. Write more. Try to get some experience at your local newspaper. If you want to go into broadcast or digital, don't poo-poo print journalism as a way to get experience, because you're going to have to be a good writer. I wrote all my own stories. I didn't have any producer write my own stories. So I would say, don't worry about majoring in journalism. Just get hands-on experience and, start from, don't worry about, leaving mommy and daddy and starting at a small station. I didn't know one person or had never been to Utica, New York, but that's where, someone was willing to hire me. So that would be those would be my initial pieces of advice for someone that wants to go into the business. And you do have to, learn how to use different types of computer data, all the ways you can make public records requests, everything that's available now, legitimate sources and government sources, online websites. Become familiar with all of those digital things as well.
Now, I mentioned one other thing you mentioned in passing, but we'll give your mother our credit, is that not a bad idea to take a type. I don't even think they have typing courses anymore, but boy, did that make your job easier. Can you imagine if you had to hunt and peck for all that stuff?
Oh, I know. If you can learn how to type. I guess now these kids with the phones.
I guess, I don't know.
Maybe that helps them with keyboards,
Well, let me ask you one other question. We're talking about moving forward. How is AI going to affect the whole industry?
Oh my gosh. Did you see where the guy that one of the initial founders of it, I believe at Google, resigned?
I just saw that today, yeah.
Yeah, I don't trust it yet. It's too early in the process. I do think down the road it could make some, mammoth changes, mainly for the better. But to me, it's too early to cast judgment on AI, especially in journalism. You can make one mistake in journalism that could end your career if you're rushing or trusting untested sources like AI.
Have you ever used it?
I have not used it yet. No.
Okay.
Have you tried it?
Yeah, after the shows, after we finish, I'll send you something that on AI. It's kind of incredible what's available. What's going to change? What people thought, with calculators, with this, math. They drew teaching them math, but they have calculators. AI is going to change things. We gotta,
It is.
You'll see. It'll be interesting.
It's going to change the spectrum of things in society, no doubt.
And not necessarily for the better, but it's out there. Matthew Schwartz, I'd like to thank you for being my guest on this edition of the BLAINESWORLD podcast. Recommend to folks Confessions of an Investigative Reporter. A lot of great, interesting stories. Also like to thank my producer, Cappy Tassetti. Hope to see you next time, same place, somewhere, same place, same time. You'll find us on the internet. You'll find us elsewhere. Matthew, you be well.